I have the pleasure today of introducing Ariel. He is a person who shared a snippet of his story with me, and I'll let him graciously make the correction, so thank you so much. It was an interesting story and one that I asked him to share, and he thought about it a little and said, okay, I can do this. So it's a different role for him, taking him out of his DVAA zone in Narrowsburg and welcoming here to Liberty. So thank you so much for coming. And without further ado, we will hear his story. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. Hi, sweetie. My name's Ariel Shanberg. I am actually, to the slight clarification that Hope mentioned, actually the child of Holocaust survivors. My father, Sasha, was born in 1942, and my mother, Judith, born in 1945. While it took a number of years for my mother to fully understand it, she actually always identified as second generation, recognized through work with different groups that she is actually first generation, having been born in Budapest in 1945. Before I get into their stories, and those are the stories that I'm looking forward to sharing, both their separate journeys, their journey together, and I think why it leads to why I am here and part of this community and getting to speak today. I want to thank Hope and the Liberty Museum and Art Center for both hosting the exhibition and this project. As we move further and further in time and further away from the events of the Shoah, we really need these moments to pass these stories on, to connect everyone's narratives. And I am honored to be somebody who carries some of that narrative, and certainly am somebody who feels shaped by it. As I noted, both my parents were born in Europe. My father in Kafkaz, which is located in the Caucasus region of what was then the Soviet Union. His parents were Poles who lived in Warsaw, who escaped after the Nazis invaded in 1939. I always like to do this math. I'm like, so wait, when did my grandparents decide to conceive a child? And when you do the basic math, it's September, October 1941 for my father, and for my mother's parents, it was in June, July of 1944, which is a pretty pivotal point because the Nazis took over and fully occupied Hungary, which was then an ally of the Nazi regime, in March of 1944. So a very interesting moment to decide to continue your family line. And I think that those two acts, not to get so corporal, but those two hopeful acts really define to me the legacy that I carry on and what has shaped me and what has guided me in so many of the areas that I am, which is this sense of hope, that even in these darkest of times, that my grandparents were looking to the future. We're looking to a more hopeful time. So a little bit on my father's story. My grandfather was a tailor who traveled the world quite a bit, actually worked in Buenos Aires along with R.E.A. Onassis on a dock. And they were ship hands helping load guests' personal belongings onto the ships. And he then left Argentina, returning to Warsaw, where he met my grandmother, who was running a diner. My grandmother was one of 8 children on her family's side. They married and went into hiding, as I noted, and moved around as one did. One of the things that actually in prepping for this talk, I really wasn't familiar with the legacy of what are referred to as the mountain Jews of the Caucasus. And there is if you are looking for a fictionalized, based on historic accounts, there's a film starring Daniel Craig that was made about Ukrainian Jews who were fighting the Nazis. And it's a whole other side to the history that wasn't known. And part of what they were able successfully to do was convince the German authorities that they were only practicing Judaism, that they weren't racially Jews, which is just kind of fascinating in terms of how one can get lost in one's own madness. And, so we won't bother them. But they were actually very successful in providing a resistance. My grandparents, with their newborn son, were able to escape the Soviet Union before Stalin closed the wall, and then spent 4.5 years in a displaced persons camp in Frankfurt, where they continued to be hopeful and had my aunt, Elka, in April of 1946. Following the establishment of the State of Israel, they moved and made Aliyah in 1948 and settled in the city of Jaffa, which, as my dad would describe it, would be, think what Manhattanites think of Harlem and the Bronx, kind of rough and not the Harlem and Bronx of today, but let's go back to the 50s then. And they were always, so to say, the secondary citizens compared to if you were from Tel Aviv. So as my father grew up in Israel, he developed very much a Sabra mentality, which I think was something that for a lot of European immigrants who made Aliyah after the war, that identity was essential to recovering from a lot of what they felt how they were victimized in specific in Europe. So with that, he did his service in the Israeli army, served in the Six-Day War, served ironically in Mossad only because a friend asked him to help him prep for the tests, the entry exam, while his friend was laid up with a broken leg. And my father said, sure. And by the time it was to take the test, he said, well, I'll take it too, because I seem to know this stuff. Kochi failed. My dad passed. But that led ultimately to him being stationed with the Israeli embassy in New York City in 1969, which in his words was a cover for him to get over here and study photography at the New School. And we'll pause on his story and switch to my mother's story. My mother's family were based in Budapest, Hungary, my mother was first generation Hungarian, so let me rephrase that. My mother's mother was born first generation, my grandmother was first generation Hungarian, her parents having come from other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they were a family of 4 children. My uncle, I just talked to my mother this morning, and I called and said, what is Bubi Bachi's real name? I've called him Bubi Bachi my entire life, and remind me what his name is? It's Joseph. So Joseph, Tilda, my grandmother Charlotte, and the youngest, Marcel or Marzi, were the children. We were really, this is one of those, whereas my grandmother on my father's side was one of 8 and the only one to survive the Holocaust, all 4 children on my great-grandparents' side and my great-grandparents actually survived. They were particularly fortunate being based in Budapest. I don't know how familiar everyone is with the history of Hungary during World War II and the Holocaust, but I'll give you a brief rundown. The Hungarian Empire allied itself with the Nazi regime, which kept the Nazis out of Hungary pretty much until about March 1944. Their approach was, the Jews of Hungary are our property, and we will manage them how we see fit. So, not saying they were kind or good, in any way, shape, or form, but that actually kept the Nazis out until March 1944. Unfortunately, by the time the Nazis did come in, Adolf Eichmann had a pretty good system. And within 2 months, half of Hungary's population, Jewish population, was deported. Pretty much entirely outside of Budapest, all the villages and small communities, their Jewish populations were depleted and taken to Auschwitz. We had a handful of relatives who were taken to Auschwitz. Interestingly enough, those relatives are the relatives who miraculously survived, emigrated to Israel. The rest of the family, and I'm skipping a little bit, which did survive, stayed actually in Hungary until 1956. But let's go back to 1944, where what the Hungarian fascists did was they set up not official ghettos, but they identified approximately 2,000 buildings as Jewish residences, and they kept the Jewish population cordoned in those areas. Men were typically put in factories and making munitions and other supplies. They were also shipped to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets with the Hungarian army. My mother's father, who was an attorney, Imre Freund, and one of the things I learned going to Budapest was Imre is basically like the Stephen or Scott of Hungary. Everybody's named Imre. And in fact, my grandmother, as you'll learn, had 2 husbands named Imre. My grandfather, who was an attorney, fell in love with my grandmother, who was the secretary to the director of the Jewish hospital in Budapest, which was one of the oldest European Jewish hospitals, established in 1802. She was reluctant to get married during the war, but he convinced her, and approximately late spring 44, they were married at the Dohani synagogue, which if you've never been to Budapest, it's one of the most beautiful synagogues I've ever seen. It's a Moorish influenced structure, and they still do services. And walking in there, and I didn't realize this was a bit of a tourist thing, but they came up and asked my brother on a Saturday morning, not unlike this, would you like to have an aliyah? And they called us up, and then of course the clerk, or not the clerk, but one of the volunteers from the synagogue came up and said, would you like to make a donation to the synagogue? And I'm like, you have this down. But really, truly a stunning, beautiful synagogue that remains to this day and is active. As the war progressed in many ways, and simultaneously coming to an end with the Allies invading in the beaches of Normandy and moving westward, things were getting ramped up in Hungary. And the Nazi regime helped facilitate kind of a political coup, and the party known as the Arrow Cross took over and were a much more extreme group of fascists in the Hungarian government. And that was when labor camps were being instituted and harsher punishments and treatments were being made to the remaining Jews in Hungary. That included my grandfather, my mother's father, who was shipped off to a labor camp. And one of the kind of complicated things, and particularly that Hungarian Jews experienced, was the commandants, the Arrow Cross commandants, in many cases, were people 3-4 years ago they might have been in business with, people they worked with, people they had relationships with. It wasn't an occupying force. My grandfather utilized that to bribe one of the commandants who was marching them through Budapest to have a little bit of time with my grandmother. and convinced my grandmother to try to have a child. Because as she recounted to me, he wasn't sure if he was going to survive or not. And this was the most important thing she could do for him and for them. So, miracle of miracles, having 2 kids. I know it doesn't happen easy. My grandmother got pregnant and gave birth to my mom in March 45, just as the Soviets were liberating the city of Budapest. Tragically, at the same time, my grandfather was dying of tuberculosis in the labor camp that he was imprisoned in. So my mother was born out of hope, unfortunately, never having met her birth father. Years later, as the family remained in Budapest, my mother met another Imre, a doctor, and they married in 1953. During this time, Hungary is under Soviet occupation, and in 1956, a countrywide revolution was attempted, and the Soviets squashed it by agreeing to peace talks and negotiations, and using that to basically decimate the leadership of the revolution. At which point in time, my grandmother said, these are her words, and I should say that my grandmother, bless her, was one of those Holocaust survivors who wanted to talk about it at any given moment. So many nights of soccer practice, when it was my brother's team was still practicing and I was sitting in the back of the Mercury Comet, which had no heat or air conditioning or seatbelts for that matter. She would say, "Have I ever told you about?" And graciously, as a good grandson I was, even when she had told me, I told her no, and she would share what she went through and what she wanted me to know. I also learned things that she didn't tell me, so there's that too. But with that, she did say, as secretary of the director of the Jewish hospital, that she was interrogated first by the Nazis in one building and then years later by the communists. And she's like, all right, at this point, I've been interrogated twice in this office, I'm leaving. So the family was of means enough that they could hire what we would commonly refer to as a coyote today, and cross the border over in darkness with very little possessions. As my mom said, if you want to know how much we came over to the United States with, my first Hanukkah was a hair comb and 3 pairs of underwear. So that was what was needed when they got here. But they escaped to Austria, where my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mom were brought over by HIAS. They had a bias in bringing doctors and professionals over, so they were able to come over on that. Unfortunately, one of our relatives, my great aunt Tilda, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and was barred from coming to the United States, which was just basically she was considered diseased and a burden, and the U.S. government wouldn't accept her as a refugee. My uncle Joseph, aka Bubi Bachi, had a bit of a different story from the rest of the family. He had moved to Holland before the war to work in textiles, and was saved by his girlfriend then, and subsequently his wife, Yutzi, who they moved to Montreal and set up a rare stamp business, different from textiles. The rest of the family relocated to the northeast of America, particularly in Newark, which only coming back years later as a student at Rutgers did I learn that history, because I came back after my first semester. I'm like, so why is there Magyar Bank and Magyar Bakery? And I'm like, I knew enough to know that Magyar is Hungarian for Hungarian. my mom's like, well, that's where we were brought when the boat brought us over in 57. And didn't know that history. And this is, again, another sidebar, and anybody who knows me in this audience knows I go on sidebars. I brought my mother to see a sculpture I had just completed in the Livingston Barracks, which was a former military training base. And as we're pulling into the barracks where the sculpture is, my mother's face starts to get paler and paler. And I'm like, what's going on? What's wrong? She goes, this is where I spent my first night in America. And so for a full semester, I had been making art and worrying about the asbestos ceiling tiles in these old military barracks, and not knowing that I could have very well have been in one of the rooms that my family had spent their very first night in the United States. Growing up in Newark, which is where they then settled, at Weequahic High School, which has such famous alum as Philip Roth. Both my mother grew up very much in the spirit of the 60s with commitment to civil rights, to activism, and social justice. It brought her to American University, as well as NYU University. And if anybody knows NYU University during the 60s, there were some interesting things going on there. Students taking over buildings and whatnot. My father, meantime, as I had said, this is now their coming together, came over in '69. For local reference, he got stuck on the thruway. He didn't make it to the concert. But both my parents studied photography at the New School, studying under such luminaries as Arnold Eagle, who, and my mother said to me once, his class was known as a good place to meet interesting boys. Unfortunately, they did not get to meet in that class. They took it at different tracks. And they subsequently met at a Christmas party, because where else would two nice Jewish kids meet, in December of 1971, and married in March of 1972. And I think what brought them together in many ways was, the fact that they had these two very different narratives, these two different paths, and that were parallel but distinct in terms of their journeys. And the hope that their grandparent, or their parents, my grandparents, had in really looking to the future during one of the darkest times of history, is what brought them together and what they instilled in me as a person. And where they put a lot of that hope, I should say, is in the power of art. Both my parents had, as I said, studied photography, had circles of friends who were artists, who always emphasized the ability of creation and making art as a way to open doors, open conversations, bring people in, into your ideas, into your world, to create empathy, to create understanding, and to open yourself up too. I think if anybody here works as an artist, you know what it is to open yourself up to learning a new process, to entering into an unknown canvas or something. And that takes a certain level of vulnerability and openness and hope, as I know. And that, I think, is where I've gotten what has led me to where I am today, and why I am so passionate about art centers like DVAA, like the Liberty Museum and Art Centers, that these are places where we can bring the community in, where we can get to be exposed to things that we don't know, ideas that we haven't seen, and hopefully find ways to connect in lasting, meaningful ways that extends well beyond the walls of a gallery or a theater or a specific event. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much for having me.